How does a real revolution get started? It's not always with a huge explosion. Sometimes it just starts with one little question that you can't get out of your head. And that's exactly what we're looking at today. The origin story of one of the most game-changing books of the 20th century, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, told right from its own preface.
It all kicked off with this moment of serious doubt. Now, for Thomas Kuhn, who was a physicist at the time, this wasn't just some small question. Oh no, this was a full-blown intellectual earthquake. It rattled the very foundation of how he saw his entire field, and in the end, how we think about science itself.
So, what was this big moment that changed absolutely everything? To really get it, we need to go back to the man himself, a physicist whose entire world was about to get flipped completely upside down.
Now, this is really important. Kuhn wasn't some outsider looking in. He was an insider, deep within the scientific world. He was living and breathing theoretical physics, finishing up his PhD, and totally bought into the standard story of how science was supposed to work.
But then, while he was prepping to teach a course on the history of science, he ran into this massive problem. See, the textbook version of science he knew was this clean, tidy, straight line of progress. But when he actually started reading the old, original scientific texts, he found something that completely blew his mind. Scientists in the past didn't just know less than we do. They thought in a fundamentally different way. It was like they were living in a whole different scientific reality. And this realization was so powerful, so jarring, that he just couldn't let it go. It actually made him abandon his whole career in physics to chase down a new obsession, figuring out how science really works, warts and all. Okay, so when you're faced with a puzzle that huge, what do you do? Well, Kuhn figured out pretty quickly that the tools of physics weren't going to cut it. He needed more. So he set off on this amazing intellectual journey, pulling in ideas from all sorts of thinkers. First up, he dove deep into the work of historians of science. And these weren't people who just listed dates and discoveries. No, thinkers like Koire and Metzger, they taught him how to almost time travel, to see the world through the eyes of a scientist from centuries ago. Suddenly, ideas that looked totally crazy and unscientific to us made perfect, logical sense in their own world. But he didn't stop there. He started grabbing ideas from psychology, philosophy, even sociology. Take Gestalt psychology, for example. You know those optical illusions where you can see a vase and then suddenly it flips and you see two faces? That idea of a perceptual flip became a huge tool for him. It was a way to describe the massive shifts he was seeing in science history. So, the big breakthrough, that aha moment, didn't happen in some quiet library or a physics lab. Nope. It happened when he spent a year hanging out with social scientists, where he noticed something odd. This was the question that just kept bugging him. In his world, physics, everybody pretty much agreed on the basic rules of the game. But in the social sciences, it seems like they were always arguing about the most fundamental questions and methods. What was going on here? What was the difference? And right there, that was it. That was the key difference. The natural sciences, like physics, they operated on this solid bedrock of agreement. That's what let them get on with solving puzzles. The social sciences, on the other hand, were in this constant state of debating the very ground they stood on. And by zeroing in on that difference, Kuhn found his big idea. The answer was a concept he decided to call a paradigm. And this idea is the absolute heart of his book. A paradigm is basically the shared framework, the set of assumptions, the classic examples that an entire scientific community agrees on. It's the map they all use, which lets them stop arguing about the map and start exploring the world. Okay, so now he had it. He had the master key, paradigm. And with that key in his hand, all those different puzzle pieces from history and psychology finally clicked together. The long road to writing the book could finally begin. And look, this thing didn't just happen overnight. This was a slow burn, a journey that took more than a decade. It started with the freedom he had at Harvard in the early 50s, led to that crucial aha moment in the late 50s, and then finally publication in 1962. It's funny how things work out. The book's final shape was actually a result of where it was supposed to be published. Since it started as a piece for an encyclopedia, Kuhn had to be short, bold, and right to the point. He even called it an essay, which is probably why it has such a powerful, punchy, argumentative feel to it. But here's the thing. As Kuhn himself makes crystal clear in the preface, he never, ever thought this essay was the last word on the topic. For him, this was just the beginning. He was basically kicking the door open for a much bigger conversation.
He's also incredibly generous, just making it so clear that this whole revolutionary idea was hammered out in a community. From James Conant, the guy who first pointed him towards history, to his friend Stanley Cavell, who he called his toughest critic, Kuhn really shows us that even the biggest ideas don't just pop out of nowhere.
And Kuhn was also his own toughest critic. He knew the book wasn't perfect, that it was incomplete. He really saw it as a first sketch, a new way of looking at things that would, he hoped, open up a ton of new questions for other people and for himself to go out and explore. And what questions they were. I mean, he points out that he barely even talked about how things like politics or economics might influence science. He was fascinated by how textbooks get rewritten after a revolution to make it all look like a smooth, inevitable story. The work wasn't done. It had really only just begun. And that brings us to the final, really provocative idea that Kuhn leaves us with. Think about it. If a scientific revolution is more than just stacking up new facts, if it's a total shift in worldview, like that Gestalt switch we talked about, then what does that do to our whole idea of scientific progress? How can we really say we're getting closer to the truth if the very rules we use to define truth change with every revolution? That is the huge, unsettling, and brilliant question at the very heart of Kuhn's work.